on Democratic policy strategy with Congressman John Lewis and Steny Hoyer, along with Clinton Gore 96 Deputy Campaign Manager Ann Lewis and Democratic consultant James Carville. And at 3:30 p.m., our live Democratic Convention preview program.
George McGovern, at what point did you decide to seek the presidency in 1972?
I think by the summer of '69, I knew I was going to run. I didn't make any formal move at that time, but in my own mind, I was pretty sure by August of '69 that I was going to give it a try in '72.
Why?
The war in Vietnam was the transcendent issue in the country and had been for several years. It had really dominated American politics, and it certainly dominated my thinking politically. I was obsessed with getting the United States out of that war. I decided early on in the 1960s that it was a dreadful policy error. I'd like to emphasize I never once criticized an American soldier fighting in Vietnam. That was not the issue. The issue was whether the policy was right that sent these young Americans to Vietnam. I had a son growing up who was draft age. I had young neighbors that I knew well, but I was deeply concerned about what seemed to me to be a mistaken policy calculation. And it seemed to me the only way to change that was to go right to the top, to go right to the president. I started dissenting when Lyndon Johnson was still in the White House and when Nixon came in '68 and really made no move to end the war. I knew I was going to challenge him in '72.
What was the McGovern Commission?
The McGovern Commission was an effort to rewrite the rules under which delegates were picked, the people who were going to decide who the Democratic nominee for president would be. In 1968, it was discovered that those rules were very unfair. In some cases, you couldn't find out when the caucuses were held. In some cases, people were selected as delegates so far ahead of the presidential election year that you didn't even know what the issues were going to be. In other cases, there were states that selected practically all male delegations, no women at all, or maybe a token woman here and there. Other states where black people had great difficulty becoming delegates. So the McGovern rules were written by 28 Democrats representing every wing of the party from right to left and across the center to come up with rules that would be fair to all Democrats and open up the delegate selection process to rank and file Democrats without regard to sex, race, color, religion, creed, or any other factor.
Democratic delegates in 1972 met in Miami that year. Any idea why that city was selected?
Well, the Florida people lobbied very hard for the convention. They had the physical facilities to handle the convention well. It was in the South. I think for various reasons we decided this would be a good place for the convention. I still think it was a good choice.
We have some video that we want to share with you and with our viewers from the 1972 Democratic Convention in Miami, delegates gathering. Your speech was at about 2:45 in the morning.
Not a very good sense of timing, I must say. That was one of the great blunders of the campaign.
We'll look at the tape.
We have had our fury and our frustrations in these past months and at this convention. But frankly, I welcome the contrast with the smug and dull and empty event which will doubtless take place here in Miami next month. We chose this struggle, we reformed our party, and we let the people in. And so we stand today, not as a collection of backroom strategists, not as a tool of ITT or any other special interest. So let our opponents stand on the status quo, while we seek to refresh the American spirit. Let the opposition collect their $10 million in secret money from the privileged few, and let us find 1 million ordinary Americans who will contribute $25 each to this campaign, a million-member club with members who will not expect special favors for themselves, but a better land for us all.
What else do you remember about that speech?
Well, let me say that what was happening that night is inexcusable. We permitted the delegates a free range to keep nominating people for the vice presidency, and it got to the point where it was kind of a game. They were even nominating the members of the press, Walter Cronkite, Roger Mudd, Eleanor McGovern was nominated, various other names were submitted. That should have been cut off. There were some unresolved problems that we were dealing with behind the scenes, but we should have watched the prime time slot and had me speaking at that time. The acceptance address at a national convention is the best single opportunity that a candidate has to address the nation. We had Senator Edward Kennedy ready to introduce me. He was standing behind the stage there for several hours, waiting for the time to come to introduce me. He made a magnificent speech. But unfortunately, outside of my family and a few ardent political fanatics, I suppose, almost no one heard or saw me in that acceptance address. I think it was one of the most costly errors of the campaign.
What were you doing at that time?
Well, I was sitting in my hotel room. I wasn't running the convention. I wasn't a delegate. I wasn't a convention manager. I was sitting in my hotel room waiting for a call that the business of the convention had been completed and that the nomination had been tendered and that they were ready for me to make my acceptance speech. I was probably the most nervous person in Miami that night, waiting for the call to come.
Do you remember what you were thinking as you walked onto the stage?
Well, it was the most important moment of my life. Even though it came after 2 o'clock in the morning, I knew that this was going to be the highlight of the campaign, and it was. I've talked about how few people saw it, but still, we knew that there were millions of Americans out there still with their television sets on. We knew that that convention hall was filled with delegates, highly enthusiastic about the campaign ahead. And I felt that I was in a very historic moment when I walked out on the stage that night. I want to tell you something you might find as a media expert hard to believe. That was the first time I used a teleprompter in the campaign. I never saw that speech on the teleprompter until I delivered it. I didn't have one practice session. I've heard since about presidential nominees working for days on their acceptance speech, working with the teleprompter. I walked out on that stage. I knew vaguely where the two teleprompter windows were, but I had never once rehearsed that speech. I think it came off pretty well in spite of that. I remember one of your colleagues telling me that he thought it was Howard K. Smith, telling me he thought it was the best speech I ever gave in my life, and I guess I agree with that.
Why Senator Eagleton of Missouri as your running mate?
Well, Senator Eagleton was interested in being on the national ticket. He was one person who was flat out campaigning for it. He was highly regarded in the Senate. He was a bright, rising star from a border state. He had the backing of labor. He was a Catholic. I was a Protestant. He had all of the usual credentials that you're looking for in a running mate. And he was an attractive, articulate, appealing political figure. It's no secret that he was not my first choice. I tried for Senator Kennedy. I tried for Senator Humphrey, Senator Muskie, numerous other people that I asked to run with me. Senator Ribicoff, who would have been the first Jewish person on the national ticket. All of them turned me down. When Senator Eagleton said yes, I was ready to embrace him.
Why did the others say no?
I think they felt I had no chance to win. against a powerfully entrenched president such as Nixon was at that time. He was at the height of his power. The polls showed him well out in front. And I think most of my senior colleagues that I had spoken to about running with me just decided it was a hopeless effort.
How long was he on the ticket?
Just about 2 weeks. We learned shortly after he was picked, when somebody leaked to the press that he had had a history of depression, emotional difficulty about that illness. And it was decided after agonizing debate that we should ask Senator Eagleton to step down. I'm not sure it was the right decision. I wasn't sure then it was the right decision. It was the one that I thought at the time was in the national interest.
Do you remember how he was informed? Did you tell him personally?
He and I, oh yes, he and I had a meeting in the Senate cloakroom. We met for several hours, talked about all aspects about it. We had talked about it earlier, first in South Dakota, then later at the home of one of my friends here in Washington, then finally in the Senate cloakroom just before we made the decision to ask Senator Eagleton to step down. He was a gentleman about it. He felt badly about the whole situation as I did. I look back on it not in anger or resentment, but in sadness. Senator Eagleton remains a friend of mine, respected former United States Senator.
Why Sergeant Shriver?
Well, Sergeant Shriver was one of the people we thought of initially. Unfortunately, he was in the Soviet Union at the time on legal business. We had only a short time to make the decision on the vice presidency after it became official that I was going to be the Democratic nominee. There was just a time factor there. We were unable to get in touch with him, or we might have started with him even before we turned to Senator Eagleton. By the way, Senator Eagleton was very high on Sergeant Shriver and thought he was a great person to replace him on the ticket. He was well qualified, he was well known. He had headed both the Peace Corps internationally and the war on poverty for the Johnson administration domestically. He was also an ambassador. So he was well qualified to be the vice presidential nominee.
So when you went into the convention in 1972, were you not certain that you were going to be the nominee?
I was not certain at the time I went to the convention. We had to first establish that we had won the California delegation fairly and according to the rules. There was no doubt in my mind that we had won that delegation according to the rules, but it was being challenged by the other candidates. We didn't know how that challenge would stand within the Democratic Convention. I can tell you in all honesty, I wasn't sure of that nomination until the roll was called and we actually went over the top.
I'd like to go through a couple of names. You've mentioned a few already, and just get your feelings either now or at the time, people who are in politics. First, Richard Nixon. What did you think of him?
Well, at that time, I didn't have a high regard for Richard Nixon. I remembered the campaign that he waged for the Congress against Jerry Voorhees, the campaign for the Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas. These people were friends of mine, highly regarded people, two of the best people ever to serve in the Congress. And when Nixon treated them as though they were un-American, pro-pink individuals, he talked about Mrs. Douglas as being pink all the way down to her underwear. I found this obnoxious behavior. I never really cared much about Nixon after that until I got to know him 10 or 12 years following the '72 campaign, when I came to know him on a personal basis. But I was very indignant about Richard Nixon. I especially was indignant that after being elected in 1968 on a pledge to end the war, he said that he had a plan in mind that he was going to invoke, and then dragging out that war for another 4 years, I just couldn't tolerate that administration.
Why did you go to the Nixon funeral?
I went to the Nixon funeral because I felt, as President of the United States, I was honoring the office. I had also come to know Nixon on a personal basis. In 1984, I met with him for a couple of hours at the apartment of his daughter Tricia in New York. We had a good man-to-man discussion. That's what it was. It wasn't a Democrat talking to a Republican. It was two former office holders talking to each other about our concerns about the country, in this case about the nuclear arms race, where we had something in common. And from that point on, I had an affable personal relationship with Richard Nixon. I not only went to his funeral out of respect for the fact that he was twice elected President of the United States, an office that I honor above all others, but I went to Mrs. Nixon's funeral a year earlier for the same reason.
Did you ever ask him about Watergate?
We never discussed Watergate. We never discussed Vietnam. Those were the two most sensitive issues between the two of us, but we did talk about the Middle East, where we had similar views. We talked about the arms race and the importance of top-level summit meetings with the Soviet leadership. When I went to see him in '84, President Reagan was in his 4th year in the White House and had never met with the Soviet leaders. I thought the time was long overdue to do that. I knew that Richard Nixon shared that view. I tried to persuade him to join with me in a joint public statement urging Reagan to do that. He thought about it seriously for a while and then decided maybe that might jeopardize his relationship with the White House. So he applauded the idea, but felt that tactically he couldn't support it.
Other names from the time, Spiro Agnew.
I never knew Agnew very well. Obviously, he violated the law. He justifiably was asked to step down from the vice presidency. I thought that was ironic, that I had so much criticism for having selected Senator Eagleton, who later turned out had a history of emotional depression, and then it turns out that the vice president twice selected by Richard Nixon, even though he had access to the FBI to check him out, turned out to be a person who had to resign from the office to avoid prosecution for a felony. I didn't think he was a great vice president or a great figure in American politics.
Hubert Humphrey.
Hubert Humphrey was my friend. He was born in South Dakota, spent the first 25 years of his life just a few miles from where I was growing up in South Dakota. He and I were next-door neighbors here in Washington for 12 years. We lived out on Coquitlam Terrace, literally right next door. I used to ride to work frequently with him, and his children grew up with my children. We were very close to the Humphreys. I had the highest regard for him and great personal affection. Where we split that led to us being rivals in 1972 was on the Vietnam War. I couldn't tolerate the policy decisions that took us into Vietnam. Hubert supported those policies, and we broke on that issue, but we never broke as friends.
Gary Hart, why did he end up running your campaign?
Well, Gary Hart was a highly talented and capable person and did a wonderful job in managing my campaign for the Democratic nomination. I think we both made some tactical errors after I was nominated, but it was an enormous achievement to win that Democratic presidential nomination against competition like Hubert Humphrey and Ed Muskie and Governor Sanford, Scoop Jackson, many others. We had 17 candidates, and I give Gary Hart considerable credit for managing that campaign to a successful nomination. Sometimes we're criticized for losing so heavily in the fall to Richard Nixon, but I think of the coach of the Buffalo Bills who, when asked if it wasn't embarrassing to lose the Super Bowl, he said, look, if you want to avoid that kind of embarrassment, just don't be good enough to get to the Super Bowl in the first place.
In retrospect, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I would have done a couple of things differently. Obviously, I would have insisted on giving my acceptance speech in prime time when we had those tens of millions of viewers out there. I would have spent more time in thoughtful television addresses to the nation and question and answer sessions on television with the nation, and less time racing around the country trying to hit 3 or 4 cities a day. I think one of the most costly aspects, though, is something I had no control over. When Governor George Wallace was shot and denied the opportunity to run as a third-party candidate, probably that set the stage for the Nixon landslide. If Wallace had run in '72 as an independent candidate, as he did in 1968, he'd have taken the South away from Nixon. He'd have taken a lot of the disgruntled Democratic voters away from Nixon, and I might very well have won that election under those conditions.
Did you know of a young political organizer named Bill Clinton at the time? Did you remember him?
I remember Bill Clinton vividly. Right out of law school, he became the coordinator of the McGovern presidential campaign in Texas. Did a good job. Hillary Clinton was working in Texas also. Her name then was Hillary Rodham. But I remember Bill Clinton well as the coordinator of that campaign in Texas. He had a co-coordinator with him, the author Taylor Branch, and the two of them worked together on Texas and did a very good job. We didn't carry Texas, but I don't blame them for that.
Is there a moment during the campaign that you often remember, people that you had met or an incident that happened that you may share with friends or family these days?
You know, one of the touching things about that campaign were the number of letters that I received from supporters both during the campaign and afterwards that can only be described as love letters. There was great affection and great warmth and great human feeling in that campaign that frankly I haven't seen since in presidential campaigns. I recall one letter from a man in Massachusetts after the campaign. He referred to the book To Kill a Mockingbird, where Atticus Finch walks into the courtroom and his children are upstairs in the balcony sitting down, and Atticus Finch, the lawyer for the defense, walks in, and an old black man who was with these children said to them, "Stand up, your father is passing by." And he said, for the rest of my life, when I think about the McGovern campaign of '72, I'm going to say, stand up, the McGovern standard bearer is passing by. That's a great tribute, not to me so much as to the idealism of that campaign.
To paraphrase the ad that you had, the people are paying for this campaign, send your contributions to the McGovern campaign. Was money a problem back then for you?
Well, we probably spent a fourth of the funds that Richard Nixon spent in 1972, but I don't think that was the decisive factor. I think an awful lot of money was wasted in the Nixon campaign. We could have used more money, but it wasn't the factor that led to our defeat. It was other things that contributed to our defeat. I think we raised and spent about $35 million in winning the nomination and in losing the general election. Now, obviously, by today's standards, that's a very small budget. That wouldn't run the two candidates today for more than about a month of their campaigns. But the healthy thing about the way that campaign was financed is that the average size of the contributions was $19 a person. I think that says something about the grassroots nature of the '72 presidential campaign.
Did you or anyone in your campaign staff ever have a conversation with the Nixon campaign folks about debates?
We did. We tried repeatedly to get debates. We challenged them both privately and publicly to debates. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only campaign in the last 40 years where there weren't presidential debates. But Nixon and his people stoutly refused not only any debates at all, but even joint appearances. As a matter of fact, they didn't even appear in the same city where I appeared. I never saw Nixon from the time I was nominated until election night.
What do you remember about the fall campaign?
I guess what I remember the best about that campaign are the outstretched hands everywhere I went. I was very close to the voters in that campaign, and in every caravan I was surrounded by people reaching out to shake hands or just touch the car or anything. I remember that sea of faces. I remember the great crowds. Even though we lost, I would speak to crowds sometimes that went over 100,000 people. A great crowd in the Post Office Square in Boston one noon that the late John McCormick told me was the biggest political crowd he'd ever seen in Massachusetts. So I remember the enthusiasm and the commitment of the supporters I had. Even though they were less than 30 million votes, they were people who were really committed. And I remember that above all else.
Was there ever a point that you thought you could win the election, or vice versa? When did you know that Richard Nixon was going to win?
I think that I really didn't commit even to myself. I really didn't admit to myself that I couldn't win that election until the day before. I suppose that intellectually in the back of my head somewhere I'd figured out the calculus on it after Wallace was shot, and realizing it was just a head-to-head race between an experienced incumbent president and a freshman senator from South Dakota, that it was unlikely that I was going to win that election. But emotionally, it wasn't until the day before the election that I suddenly realized we were going to be defeated. I'll say this to you, though, it never occurred to me even then that I would be defeated as overwhelmingly as I was in 1972. I didn't factor in probably as carefully as I should have the way that electoral college works, and that if you lose a state even by one vote, you don't get a single electoral vote out of that state.
The morning after the election, do you remember what you were thinking?
One of the nice stories about the period after the election is that by practice, the Secret Service takes you to your home the day after your defeat. They stay with you until they actually deliver you to your home. So they flew back from Sioux Falls, South Dakota with us the day after the election, took me to my home here in Washington, and there was a young Secret Service agent who was with me at the end. I won't mention his name, but he said, "You know, Senator McGovern, I just want to say one thing to you. There was something over 100 agents that at various times were with you from the Secret Service during your campaign, and generally we're kind of conservative guys. Most of us began this campaign committed to President Nixon, but I think I can tell you that you got every vote among these Secret Service agents by the time the election rolled around." That meant a great deal to me, because those guys knew everything about me. They knew all my secrets, they knew my weaknesses, my faults. So I had a kind of a landslide of my own, even though it was a mini landslide on the part of the Secret Service. I hope this doesn't get them in trouble after all these years, but that meant a great deal to me.
When history writes the books on George McGovern and politics in the 70s and early 80s, what do you want them to say about you?
I'd like to have them say that I not only fought to end the war in Vietnam, one of the earliest opponents of that war, that I attacked it on policy grounds right at the top, but also that I challenged the excesses of the Cold War, that I tried my best in all my years in the Senate to cut down on the arms race, to bring it under control, to open up direct negotiations with the Soviets and the Chinese, and that I was advocating that course very early on in my career, that it was a central part of my efforts in the Senate. I'd also like people to remember that I led the fight against hunger, both at home and abroad in the Senate.
And what about George McGovern, the man?
I'd like to have them remember me as a person who said what he thought, what he honestly believed on public issues.
Senator McGovern, thank you.